Now, this past Saturday morning, I was sitting in my home office listening to a CD I recorded a few days earlier on strategy, and I was checking it for any changes I might need to make. My 6-year-old son, Luke, came into the room, and he plopped down on the big brown leather chair. I watched him listen for a few minutes, and finally I had to ask, "So, Luke, what do you think of Dad's new CD on strategy?" He paused for a moment and said, "It sounds like church." And not making that connection, I said, "Church? How is it like church?" He said, "Well, there's a lot of talking. I don't understand most of it, and I think I'm getting sleepy." And it's very easy for strategy to be that way, but hopefully not today. Now, we've heard insanity defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. In business, insanity is doing the same things in the same ways year after year after year and expecting miraculous new growth. I call it the organizational lobotomy, working without thinking. Consider your organization. Are the people you work with highly strategic, or are they constantly fighting fires and being reactive like bumper cars at a carnival? Is strategy an annual 2-day pilgrimage to an off-site meeting at the Holiday Inn, or is it a daily habit? There's a simple but often overlooked premise in business, and that is new growth comes from new thinking. New growth comes from new thinking. Expecting new growth for your business without new ways of thinking about it is like a farmer expecting new crops to grow without first planting the seeds. There's a simple framework I developed called the 3 A's of strategy, or the 3 disciplines of strategic thinking. And those 3 A's are acumen, allocation, and action. Acumen is the insight. All great strategy, all great projects, all great initiatives start with that insight, that so what, that aha. The second A is allocation. Allocation is our ability to focus resources, which are your time, talent, and budget, by making trade-offs. As we'll see today, strategy is as much about what you choose not to do as it is about what you choose to do. And the third A is action. Action is our ability to stay focused on what's important to the business and not get distracted by the urgent things that pop up on email and voicemail. The definition of excellence is deviation from the norm. Excellence is deviation from the norm. You know, if we're doing the same normal things that other HR folks are doing in other normal companies in the same normal ways that the market expects us to do them, we will never be excellent. So push yourself to think about not how are we better, but how are we different that's bringing value to our customers. And you look at companies like General Motors at $150 billion, Lehman Brothers at $60 billion going bankrupt. Today, more than ever, having the most resources guarantees nothing. It's how we use or allocate those resources that really matters. And so the second A in our framework is allocation. Allocation is our ability to focus resources by making trade-offs. Trade-offs are choosing one path and not the other. As an example, several years ago, my wife Ann and I were on safari in Africa, and we took a tour of a Masai Mara tribal village led by a native guide. And he said, "The tribal leader in this village has 7 wives because the women in the village do most of the work, from washing the clothes in the stream to building the huts that you see out of sticks and cow dung." So the huts, the houses they live in, are actually made of sticks and dried cow dung, which is interesting. Anyway, so we're finishing up the tour, and the tribal leader, the one with 7 wives, emerges from his hut and begins talking with some of the tourists. As we were about to leave, I noticed the tribal leader talking to my wife, Ann. Thinking this might be her contingency plan, I wandered over to eavesdrop on the end of the conversation. And he said to her, "We have much work to do here, but our lives are simple and good. I am always looking for the right people to carry on our traditions. I find you to be attractive and sturdy. Would you like to be one of my wives?" So after a long pause by Anne, a little too long for my liking, she said, "You know, I love the land here, and the animals are certainly beautiful, but seeing as how I'm already married, I'll respectfully have to pass. So on the bouncy Jeep ride back to camp, I couldn't let that conversation go without just a little jab. So I said, 'You know, honey, it sounds like your decision earlier boiled down to me or a house of cow dung.' And she said, 'Yes, and it was much closer than you think.'" Because in business, as in our personal lives, we're constantly faced with trade-offs. And trade-offs involve incompatible activities. More of one thing means less of another. And inherently, when we're making trade-offs, we're making decisions. And the word decision comes from the Latin word decidere, which means to cut off. If you have trees on your property, you know that every few years you've got to cut off, you've got to prune some of the low branches, some of the dead branches, to promote new growth. We're really good about adding things to our plate each year. But what we don't tend to do is take things off of our plate. Are you doing the same things in the same ways, in the same tactics year after year? Or are you moving away from the status quo and doing things differently? The number one driver of revenue growth is the reallocation of resources from underperforming initiatives to overperforming initiatives throughout the year. Most companies reallocate resources once a year, and then it pretty much looks like it did last year. The great companies, the ones with the best growth, are the ones that are looking at their resources on a monthly or quarterly basis and saying, how can we add new value or different value to what we're doing? Most people say, "Rich, I just don't have the time or the people to do strategy." And hopefully what you're seeing today is that strategy is not an event. It's a dialogue. And you can use the questions and some of the tools that we've talked about to start that dialogue. Hi, remember me? I'm your strategic plan. You don't call, you don't write. What am I supposed to think? Oh, sure, at the end of last year, we were hot and heavy. We took that 2-day getaway to the strategic planning offsite, and you showered me with time and attention. You told me how much I meant to you and said we'd always be together. You even brought me to the annual kickoff meeting and proudly presented me to everyone. Then, a few weeks passed, and I noticed you paying less attention to me and more attention to that slinky young thing you call BlackBerry. After a few months, I didn't see or hear from you at all. I just sat on your shelf, dressed in this red, faux leather, 3-ring binder collecting dust. Now it's time to start planning for next year, and all of a sudden, you're back, wanting more? Well, I'm sorry. I'm just not that type of strategic plan. Now, any resemblance to that previous scene is completely unintentional, but highly likely. Let's face it, most of us don't use our plan to drive daily activity. And if we're not using the plan to drive daily activity, we may as well not have done one at all.